Hello everyone, this is Mike Corrali with the International Political Economy course. This lecture is titled Constructivism, where we look at Chapter 5 in our textbook, Introduction to International Political Economy, 7th edition, by David Balam and Bradford Dillman. Looking at rationalism and constructivism as one of the perspectives of international political economy, along with classic liberalism, mercantilism, and structuralism, allows us another opportunity to look at the conflicts of politics and economics in our international system. With the theories and agent structure, we see, and Balam tells us in Chapter 5, first, neo-realism, which is the nature of the international system, shapes states' behavior. We have liberalism, where behavior of the actors shapes the nature of the international system. And then we have constructivism, where actors and systems are mutually constituted. As we did with liberalism in Japan and Germany, mercantilism with the United States, and structuralism with France, we are going to be using the United Kingdom as our case study to look at constructivism. Looking at constructivism, then, we're pointedly on the lookout for norms and conventions that drive the conflicts of politics and economics. In norms, we're looking at standards of appropriate behavior. And we look at the United Kingdom and the institutions of government in the United Kingdom from a constructivist perspective. The norms are immediately noticeable. There are traditional elements that include the antiquated features of the monarchy and the unwritten constitution in the British system. We have gradualism. We have the existence of the monarchy itself. We have the existence of the House of Lords and the role of Parliament. Now, we know from our English history that the unwritten constitution of England really had its foundations in the year 1215 with the Magna Carta. We know that Magna Carta established that even the monarch would be bound by law, that there must be common council before taxes were imposed, that courts had to be held at regular times and at fixed places, that there was an inherent due process, and most importantly for our studies today, it established the ideal of the freedom of trade. The unwritten constitution of England was furthered in 1689 in what was termed the Glorious Revolution that established the Act of Settlement between King William and Queen Mary and Parliament. In this, it established parliamentary supremacy as the final say in establishing law in England. Now, which isn't to say that the king or the queen doesn't, in theory, have the absolute and judicially unchallengeable power to refuse their assent to conventions or laws. Nevertheless, the Parliament is supreme, even though the king or queen is sovereign. These are the unwritten rules of the British constitutional system, furthered by what we call a nomocracy, N-O-M-O-C-R-A-C-Y, nomocracy, that is the rule of law. And so the British parliamentary system then establishes the supremacy of the rule of law as established by Parliament. And so these unwritten rules forming the Constitution in England are really broken down into law. And this includes the Prime Minister, their functions and how they're appointed. Again, the fact that the King or Queen, in theory, has absolute, judicially unchallengeable power to refuse their assent. And finally, that the courts and the judgments of the courts are actually subsumed to the Parliament. In other words, there is no power greater than Parliament, and that includes the court or the sovereign, the king. Quite a different system than what we're used to seeing when we looked at France, when we looked at Germany, when we looked at the United States, and when we looked at Japan. And so these different systems of government then are establishing different opportunities, case studies for us to look at the different perspectives of international political economy. So then, going further into our British Constitution, we turn to the role of the monarchy. The Queen, the monarch, the rule of one, must give royal assent to all legislation passed by both houses of Parliament. The Queen opens Parliament and dissolves it, and formally makes treaties with foreign states, creates peerages, makes many top appointments in civil service, is the head of the armed forces, and ostensibly the head of the judiciary. Now, the monarchy in Britain, as we know, is an indigenous institution, because since prior to it, the Angles and the Saxons were based on chiefdoms or on principalities. In the original heptarchy of East Anglia, Mercia, Northumberland, Kent, Sussex, Essex, and Wessex, the kings were originally elected and weren't hereditary. Kingship was the central institution around which the Constitution grew. Now, this suggests there is common law, or the customs of the people, that are going to be establishing this monarchy and this system of government that rose in England. As we said, the king was limited in his acts by a steadily growing body of customs and agreements such as Magna Carta. We know that the shires, which are called counties after 1066 in the Norman invasion, were the local jurisdictions under the king whose main job was making war. The significance of this general scheme of local government lies not in its modern survival as in the formulation of an intractable habit of local autonomy as a convention. And remember, convention and custom are at the heart of constructivism. So looking at the formation of these habits, local autonomy as a convention, is at the heart of our study of constructivism. With the monarchy, we know that they're constitutionally bound to take the advice of their prime minister. The Queen must sign her own death warrant, they say, if two houses of Parliament unanimously send it to her. The last sovereign to actually refuse to give royal assent was Queen Anne in 1707. The Queen's role in establishing government would be heightened if, in a general election, it produced no clear majority for a government to be formed. Looking at the structure of the British government, then, we're drawn to the Parliament in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. We see the executive with Her Majesty's government, i.e. the Prime Minister. We see the judiciary, or the UK courts of law. And finally, we see the Crown, the personification of sovereignty, the monarch. Insofar as the British Parliament, in the British Constitution, the British Parliament is noted for its form and for its antiquity. They call it the mother of all parliaments. It was the first established parliament that still continues to this day. There is, in running the parliament, a combination of statutory law, common law convention, and authoritative interpretations of the statutory law and the common law. The British system is held together by the Parliament, which, in theory at least, has the power to repeal any law it likes. And constitutional changes created by the Parliament tend to be very long-lasting. Again, the British Parliament is referred to in the Westminster model, or what is established at Westminster, which includes the ideals of parliamentary sovereignty, parliamentary democracy, the existence of a cabinet government, which is the center of British politics, that formulates and presents policy to the Parliament. The cabinet government is the supreme ruling body of the executive branch, and together they have collective responsibility. So again, the British Parliament establishes the cabinet government, the Prime Minister, and the different cabinet level officers, the different secretaries, the Foreign Secretary, the Home Secretary, the Treasury Secretary. And then collectively, this government is responsible to the Parliament as a collective. So it's not just the Prime Minister that is responsible, it is the Prime Minister and his cabinet. Looking then further into the British Parliament, we see primarily three overriding principles. There is no area that Parliament can't make law about. It is supreme. No other body can negate parliamentary law, as I suggested earlier. That includes the courts and the sovereign. And the Parliament can't restrict, by law, by legislation, the actions of any future parliaments, because that future parliament, at that time, must be supreme. And so as we're going to continue, especially when we look at the European Union and the European Community, the British Parliament is made up of two chambers, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The House of Commons, most commonly equated to the United States House of Representatives, represents constituent interest, examines and passes legislation, and scrutinizes the activities of the government. We will go further into the House of Commons in a moment. With the House of Lords, which we will also go into further, we understand that it processes and revises legislation, that it acts as a check on the parliamentary government, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, that it provides a forum of independent expertise, and does act as a final court of appeal from the judiciary. So as cases come up through the judiciary, the House of Lords acts as a final court of appeal. In creating the House of Commons, the road to Parliament, in the election process, holds what's called the first past the post, or the person winning the most votes wins, which is common in countries that were of British origin or originally British colonies. A commission known as the Boundary Commission deals with the size of the districts of which a member of Parliament represents, and party allegiances of those elected members of Parliament are not in the same proportions as the votes cast throughout the country. Finally, the turnout in elections for Parliament have been declining in the last 20 years. The House of Commons, since 1945, has had a common average life expectancy of 3 years and 7 months. So the Prime Minister can call for dissolving Parliament, asking the Queen for a royal proclamation. After Parliament is dissolved, at the request of the Prime Minister, the basic rule is that a general election must take place on the 17th day, excluding Sundays and holidays, following the date of the proclamation dissolving the Parliament. So as we're in the United States, our elections every 2 years for the House of Representatives, every 6 years rotating for the Senate, and every 4 years for the President, the campaign begins well in advance of those elections. In the United Kingdom, the election must take place on the 17th day following the date of the proclamation, so within 20 days. So looking at the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, we understand that the Prime Minister is considered really first among equals. They are a member of the Parliament and a leader of the majority party. They speak legitimately for all members of Parliament. They choose the cabinet ministers and important subordinate posts. They make decisions in the cabinet with the agreement of the ministers. They campaign for and represent the party in parliamentary elections, and they shape cabinet decisions into legislative policy. So that is the role of the Prime Minister in the government. Insofar as the cabinet, the collective cabinet, is the center of policy making in the British political system. As leaders of the majority party, they are elected by the people, and they take collective responsibility for making the policy of the country. The most important cabinet-level officers are the Foreign Office, the Home Office, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So the Foreign Office, the Foreign Secretary, would most closely relate to our Secretary of State. Except, remember, in our system, in the United States system, the President takes advice from his Secretary of State, but makes decisions personally. In the United Kingdom system, since it is a collective cabinet center for policy making, the Foreign Secretary, the Secretary of State, is responsible for developing policy on behalf of the cabinet government. We remember that parties exist in the UK system as they do in the United States system, and as in the United States, party discipline is very important in British politics. If party members do not support their party leadership, the government may fall into crisis. And this comes to what is known as a vote of confidence, or a vote of no confidence. So when the government, remember the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, loses the confidence of the Parliament, it is generally a party-related issue. So usually it's a vote on a key issue within the party, this vote of confidence. If the issue is not supported, then the Cabinet, by tradition, must resign immediately, and new elections for members of Parliament must be held, as I suggested, as soon as possible. This is usually avoided by settling policy differences within the majority party membership, so it never quite comes to that vote of confidence or no confidence. If the party loses a vote of confidence, all MPs, members of Parliament, lose their job. So there is plenty of motivation to vote along the party line. In the upper chamber, the House of Lords, unlike members of Parliament, Lords are unelected and unpaid, obviously except for certain allowances to cover attendance, which is voluntary. There is no upper limit in the number of members. There are currently 730 peers, or Lords, in the United Kingdom that have the right to sit in the House of Lords. The House of Lords is the final court of appeal on points of law for the whole of the United Kingdom in civil cases, and for England, Wales, and Northern Ireland in criminal cases. This work is carried out by the Law Lords, or a subset of the House of Lords, who act specifically as a court of appeal. So, in the House of Lords, we find two distinctions. First are life peers. Life peers are appointed by the Crown by the advice of the Prime Minister. The majority of the total membership is made up of life peers of about 600, and Titles cease on the death of the peer. They are not hereditary titles, hence the term life peer. There are also, though, law lords. There are up to 12 that I suggest hear appeals from the lower courts. They answer questions on major points of law, and in 2009, an independent UK Supreme Court opened, ending the idea of judicial function of the Parliament, although that has been backed off and is currently in flux, in change. In England, we also have a bureaucracy made up of civil servants. There are hundreds of thousands of civil servants in the UK. They administer laws and deliver public services. Most do clerical and routine work for the bureaucracy. There are a few hundred who directly advise ministers and oversee the work of departments. There are top civil servants and bureaucrats who usually stay within their departments, while ministers are party officials who move with party demands. Therefore, the top civil servants often have a great deal of input into policy making. And so this is very similar to the system that we have in the United States with the bureaucracy, where the cabinet-level secretaries, who in this instance would be equated to the ministers, come and go with presidential administrations. So the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Treasury can be changed either by a sitting president or in transition between presidents. Same is true in the UK, again, where the ministers, being party officials, move with party demands, but the top civil servants and bureaucrats usually stay within their departments. The bureaucracies are served in the United Kingdom by an interesting aberration that's called quangos, or quasi-non-governmental organizations. There are about 6,000 at present, and 90% operate at the local level. Some advise on policy, others deliver services, but all are created by Acts of Parliament and are publicly funded. A couple of examples would be the Forestry Commission, the British National Trust, that covers publicly held land and special historical sites, and also the Crown Estate. The Crown Estate is a quango, a quasi-non-governmental organization that supports specific royal residences such as Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. The sovereign, Queen Elizabeth, doesn't herself own Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. They are held in trust by the Crown Estate, which is a quango, or a part of the bureaucracy. As I've suggested before, the Judiciary Branch in the United Kingdom comes under parliamentary sovereignty. In other words, Parliament's decisions are final, and thus has limited in the United Kingdom the development of judicial review as we have in the United States. So again, remember, all this is struck to constructivism and how the system of government and the conventions and norms of a political system help drive the political environment and the economy. If then in the United Kingdom the Judiciary Branch doesn't have the ability to overthrow Acts of Parliament, this means that Parliament's sovereignty is absolute. So the only thing the British courts can do is to determine whether government decisions violate the common law or previous acts of the Parliament. By tradition, British courts cannot impose their rulings upon Parliament, the Prime Minister, or the Cabinet. Now, we know that the law lords can settle disputes from lower courts. They are a court of appeal, but they do not have the power of judicial review, so their authority is inherently limited. As I suggested in the prior slide, there was a Constitutional Reform Act of 2005 that provides for a Supreme Court of the United Kingdom to take over the existing role of the law lords, but that is in flux in 2020, and we're not quite sure where that's going to land yet. So then, remember that the judicial branch, as established in 2009, currently has the highest appellate court in all matters of English law, Welsh law, Northern Irish law, Scottish law, and the devolution of issues. There are 12 professional judges appointed by the House of Lords. There are no term limits, but they can be removed by an address of Parliament because Parliament is supreme. Judges are forced to retire either at 70 or at 75, and the composition of the court is a president, a deputy president, and 12 permanent justices. So that is a review of the UK political system, looking at it as a very unique system, an unwritten constitutional system of norms and conventions. It's really very unique, which lends it well to our study of constructivism. Now, examining constructivism in and of itself is divided, as we know by our reading in Chapter 5, of Rationalism and Constructivism. So we begin with Rationalism. Rationalism is the philosophic view that regards reason as the chief source and test of knowledge. A rationalist uses logic as the chief principle in knowledge. This means that everything we learn, and we use reason in every situation above all else. Our reason also ultimately provides justification for our morals and our beliefs. We are rational. Reason, rationality, dictates how we see and view certain situations, and our opinion of right and wrong toward the situation is driven by that rationalism. So the guiding principles of social constructivism are that knowledge is constructed through human activity, and individuals create meaning of their actions through their interactions. Before we grapple with the constructivist approach to IPE, it is worth noting something distinctive about the discipline of political science. Different disciplines define and organize themselves in different ways. For example, historians define themselves as those who adhere to a particular methodology for the construction of a narrative, to wit, historiography. As chroniclers, they document the progression of events and lower the barriers to understanding that progression. As social scientists, they may attempt to uncover causal relationships. Within the discipline, they tend to arrange themselves based on the distinctions of geographic and temporal space, or the time frame. For example, Tudor England, or the American Revolution. With historians, they are meant to be competent to discuss all the big issues within the context of their chosen time and space. So if you're looking at Tudor England or the American Revolution, it's inherent that you will be competent to discuss gender in Tudor England, and politics in the American Revolution, culture, society, science, the economy, and religion. Economists define themselves according to a specific approach, which is either positive and normative, as well as specific framework, i.e. micro or macroeconomics, and the methodology they use, be it statistics, hypothesis formulation and testing, etc. In general, economists attempt to explain how individuals maximize their preferences given environmental constraints. Economists utilize their same kit of tools to explain everything from dental hygiene to nuclear war. Political scientists, oh, we few, we happy few. Political science is defined rather differently from the disciplines of history and economics. Political science is a discipline defined by its substantive concern, that is, politics, rather than its approach or its methodology. And so if in history you have an approach, historiography. If in economics you have a methodology, in political science we're defined by our substantive concern, that is, politics. So, to be a political scientist, one must study political economy, conflict, organization, culture, process, behavior, and theory. And so, insofar as approach, there are numerous theories: game theory, historical narrative, use of statistics, use of case studies, interviews, surveys, rational choice mechanics, structural and symbolic interaction, etc. In other words, there is no single distinctive scientific approach that political scientists use to perform their studies. We use it all. So, this may feel a bit schizophrenic. A critic might say this makes political science fractured. It doesn't have the cohesiveness, then, of the methodology of history, right, or approaches of economics. It feels scattered. It feels fractured. While this diversity may inspire constant conflict, it also brings the benefits of intellectual cross-fertilization. Rationalism and constructivism, in fact, are the products of this kind of intellectual cross-fertilization. Rationalism and constructivism, as an approach, a perspective of studying international political economy, along with classic liberalism, mercantilism, and structuralism, is just one more way of trying to get at the question, what is international political economy? And so rationalism and constructivism, as Balan points out in Chapter 5, tries to broaden the net, tries to broaden the approach, the search, and broaden the questions being asked. So again, going back to the norms and the conventions to get at the heart of a political tradition, and how then that political tradition establishes itself in the economic life of the nation. Going back again then to these rationalists, explain how actors maximize their goals given various constraints. But they pay little attention to the source of these actors' goals. Instead, these preferences are treated as exogenously determined, as outside the political process. So, exogenously means outside of, or external factor. So, an external factor determining the political process. Looking at the approaches, then, in rationalism, we understand that autonomous actors, such as states, policymakers, possess exogenously, from external factors, determined interests. These actors attempt to maximize their preferences in a constrained environment, specifically an anarchic environment, as in mercantilism's cry of no world police. And so these actors attempt to maximize their preferences in a constrained environment, specifically this anarchic environment, this free-for-all. So, in the rationalist approach, then, IPE is the sum total of the actors' attempts to maximize their preferences given these constraints. These theorists all think about the states in the international system in the same way that economists think about actors in the market. They all employ the economist's rational choice approach. Thus they are sometimes called rationalists. But then we also have constructivists. Constructivists utilize a different approach and pursue different questions. Constructivists want to ask, how are these actors' all-important preferences formed in the first place? They want to endogenize several of the elements that rationalists treat as exogenously determined, in other words, coming from within. instead of from without. Instead of looking at the United Kingdom as a political economic expression in the world stage from a rationalist approach, how does the UK manifest its political economic policy by virtue of its internally formed, its internally revealed elements? And so this goes to the heart of identity and interest formation. How then do constructivists study and understand where identities and interests come from? So hopefully you'll see there's a method to my madness, guys. In constructivism, institutions are important. And we're looking at the UK and these institutions in an unwritten constitution that are inherently based on norms and conventions instead of on a written constitution. These institutions are all important in constructivism. Sovereignty is changing and is influenced both by state and non-state actors. Constructivists look at the social content of international organizations, norms that govern behavior and shape interests, and decipher how these interests influence actors. In constructivism, they believe that international organizations can serve as agents of social construction. IGOs, international governmental organizations, have the potential to be major actors with independent effects on international relations. Transnational networks of experts change or shape understanding of more and more collective issues. As with rationalists, there are approaches in the constructivist philosophy. While economists may best explain how actors maximize their preferences, sociologists have the most to say about how actors' preferences actually develop in the first place. Constructivists understand identities and interests to be the product of processes rather than structure, such as the idea of political socialization, or how we gain our understanding of our political world and our relationship to it. In other words, there is a discourse analysis, or an analysis of how the conversation happens, how the discourse happens, how we create our political identity. In the constructivist approach, they argue that it is through reciprocal interaction. In other words, that we create the relatively enduring social structures in terms of which we define our identities and interests. So let me do that again, just so that we're clear. It is through reciprocal interaction, how we relate to one another through enduring social structures, that we define our identities and our interests. So again, if we're looking at the UK from a constructivist approach, if you're looking at the social structures and the political structures, they're going to define the identities and the interests of the individuals. We said in classic liberalism that it is the individual that informs the political discourse. The constructivist approach is putting that on its head, saying that it is the social structures that define our identities and our interests. Check? Which sounds more like what we learned in the structuralist perspective. And so we understand that constructivism and rationalism are simply approaches, right? They're perspectives, how we look at international political economy. And scholars identify constructivism and rationalism as approaches rather than individual theories or even a school of theories. As approaches, they simply provide an understanding of what there is to study the ontology and how we study it, the epistemology. But the two approaches differ significantly along several dimensions. So remember, ontology is what is there to study. Epistemology is how to study it. With the rationalist ontology, we look at interstate interactions, we look at the outcome, we look at the state's interests, we look at the international environment, we look at the strategies for maximizing interests, and we look at the building blocks of what the system is. So, again, interstate interactions, the outcome, the results, the state's interests, the international environment, the strategies for maximizing the state's interests, and the building blocks that we're dealing with. That is what we're going to study. That is the rationalist ontology. The rationalist epistemology, or how to study, is borrowed from economics. So states are assumed to enjoy bounded rationality, right? That they can make rational decisions, that they are rational in their core, at their base. States attempt then to use strategies, rational strategies, to maximize their preferences given their constraints. Different theories specify different values for these building blocks. In the constructivist ontology, what to study, we're looking at interstate interactions. We look at the determinative process. We look at state interests. We look at the international environment. And again, strategies for maximizing interests and the products or the outcome of the process. In the constructivist epistemology, we borrow more from sociology. Remember, the rationalists were borrowing from economics. The constructivists are borrowing from sociology. In other words, they're looking at the structure, the interests, the environment, and the strategies, and that these cannot be understood apart from the process or the international interaction. States construct these elements through their interactions. And so, what is the key difference? In rationalism, structure is independent of process. In constructivism, structure is dependent on process. To what extent does structure depend on process insofar as interstate interactions, state interests, strategies for maximizing interests, and the international environment go? More so, are these calibrated at no influence, limited influence, or extensive influence? And so our seminar question is, are there significant differences between rationalist and constructivist approaches evidenced in the UK system of government? So again, the rationalist ontology, we're looking at interstate interactions, the outcome, state interests, the international environment, strategies for maximizing interests, and the building blocks. How we're studying it, borrowing from economics. States are assumed to enjoy bounded rationality, that they make their own decisions. States attempt to use strategies to maximize their preferences given their constraints, and that different theories specify different values for those building blocks. In constructivist ontology, interstate interactions, the determinative process, state interests, international environment, strategies for maximizing interests, and the products of process. And the constructivist epistemology, borrowing from sociology, suggests that structure, interest, environment, and strategies cannot be understood apart from the process or the international interaction, and that states construct these elements through their interactions. They're a product of that interaction. So, again, the key differences and the rationalist and constructivist approaches evidenced in the UK system of government that we outlined in this parliamentary model, this constitutional. So, my friends, that's it for constructivism. Again, we're relying on Chapter 5 in David Balam and Bradford Dillman, Introduction to International Political Economy, and I look forward to reading your essays. Have a marvelous day.